There are very few places left in Europe that still feel truly wild and unique. Białowieża in eastern Poland, right on the border with Belarus, is one of them. At first glance, this place seems quiet and unassuming. But hidden here is one of the continent's most extraordinary landscapes. A primeval forest that has survived for centuries at the crossroads of cultures, borders, and empires. Today, Białowieża is a place that seems lost in time, where Orthodox churches stand beside colorful wooden homes, where regional food still reflects Eastern traditions, and where traces of tsarist history remain scattered through the forest. Beyond the town's last houses begins the forest itself, a vast landscape of ancient trees, mist-covered meadows, and hidden wildlife, stretching across the Polish-Belarusian border. For years, we had wanted to experience Białowieża for ourselves, drawn by its wilderness, remoteness, and the possibility of seeing European bison roaming freely through the forest. This is our journey to Białowieża. And this is where it began, on the road east towards the Belarusian border. Along the way, we passed through villages shaped by centuries of Eastern influences and followed quiet, rural roads leading through seemingly endless stretches of forest. Before long, passing military vehicles became a reminder that despite the calm atmosphere, this remains a very active border region. As evening approached, we arrived at our accommodation for the next few days, Tatanka Dom w Puszczy, a beautiful wooden house located right at the edge of the forest. With its tastefully decorated lounge and beautifully furnished bedrooms, modern and spacious bathrooms, as well as its large outdoor deck, garden, and our very own private sauna, we immediately fell in love with our base to explore the wilderness around Białowieża. For our first evening in town, we headed to Restauracja Stoczek 1929 for dinner. The restaurant specializes in regional cuisine from Podlasie and eastern Poland, with influences from neighboring countries reflected throughout the menu. That evening, we tried several regional dishes, including beef cabbage rolls, fish soljanka, a hearty Eastern European soup, kartacze, basically a giant potato dumpling stuffed with venison, pelmeni, traditional Eastern European dumplings, as well as marcinek cake, a traditional local dessert with up to an incredible 20 layers. The food was absolutely divine, a great first taste of Białowieża. After dinner, we returned to the quiet forest surroundings of our accommodation and spent the rest of the evening by the crackling campfire, looking forward to finally exploring Białowieża the next morning. It was a short night. We had set the alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning, dawn generally being considered one of the best times to see European bison in the wild. And if there was one animal we were hoping to encounter during our stay in Białowieża, it was this one. Outside, a layer of fog hung over the meadows as we made our way through the sleeping village. From the roadside, we spotted 2 deer playfully chasing each other through the fog, seemingly unaware of our presence. It was a beautiful sight, and an encouraging start to the morning. Just a short drive down the road, we stopped at the Pogorzelce Observation Tower, a wooden viewing platform overlooking open meadows, where bison are often seen feeding in the early morning hours. The best place to see bison are open meadows like these, either around dusk or around dawn. The atmosphere here is perfectly calm and peaceful. There's just a wisp of fog over the grass. Let's see if we get lucky. The meadow stretched out before us like a natural stage, framed by the ancient forest beyond. Every now and then, we found ourselves staring at a darker patch of vegetation or a shadow along the tree line, wondering whether it might finally be a bison emerging from the forest. But each time, it turned out to be nothing more than a fallen tree, a bush, or a trick of the morning light. We stayed on the platform for quite some time in the hope that our patience might eventually be rewarded. Unfortunately, no bison appeared. Even so, there was something special about simply being there. Watching the fog drift across the meadow, listening to the forest wake up around us, and knowing that somewhere beyond the trees these animals really did exist made the experience feel worthwhile nonetheless. By now, however, the lack of sleep was beginning to catch up with us, so we decided to head back to our accommodation for some rest. After a few more hours of sleep, we still had most of the morning ahead of us. Time to explore the town. Białowieża feels quite different compared to other places we have visited in Poland. Here, colorful wooden houses line the streets, and the rhythm of life feels refreshingly slower and more connected to nature. The grey-domed Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas is one of the town's most recognizable landmarks and adds to the distinctly Eastern character of the village. The presence of white storks is a constant reminder that the surrounding wilderness is just around the corner. Tucked away on the edge of town, we unexpectedly came across an elegant wooden building. With its ornate architecture and manicured grounds, it immediately caught our attention. Curious to find out more, we stopped for a closer look. As it turned out, we had stumbled upon Towarowa railway station, one of Białowieża's most fascinating historic landmarks. Why was such an impressive railway station built here in the first place? After all, Białowieża is relatively small, deep in the forest and far from Poland's major population centers. And what was the story behind the old, luxurious railway carriages still standing on the tracks nearby? We soon discovered that both were linked to the same surprising story. The Białowieża train station was built back in 1903 to serve the Russian Tsar who maintained a hunting lodge in town. These days, it's beautifully restored with a wonderful restaurant inside it, and right up ahead of me are some old train carriages, also restored, where you can spend the night in luxury accommodation on the rails. Back then, Białowieża was part of the Russian Empire, and the vast surrounding forest had become one of the Tsar's favorite hunting grounds. As the imperial estate expanded, so too did the railway network, transforming access to what had once been a remote forest. Towarowa station is one of the most impressive surviving reminders of that era. Today, it houses Restauracja Carska, where the connection to the Russian imperial era remains unmistakable. Historic photographs, period decor, and countless references to the tsars create the impression of stepping back into a very different chapter of Białowieża's history. Outside, several tables had been placed directly on the old railway tracks, creating one of the most unusual cafe settings we had ever come across. Here, we decided to sit down and sample some local sweet treats. Originally built as a secondary station serving the Imperial Railway complex, Towarowa would later become the destination for both passenger and freight trains. Today, instead of welcoming arriving trains, Towarowa station has found a new purpose. Walking through its beautifully restored surroundings felt a little like stepping back into the early days of the railway. As we learned more about the station's history, it left us curious to discover what else remained from Białowieża's imperial past. Somewhere nearby stood the imperial hunting residence, a retreat built for one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. Naturally, we wanted to see it for ourselves. Looking at the map, one location seemed particularly promising: Park Pałacowy, Palace Park. If the Tsar's residence had survived anywhere, this seemed like the place to look. So we headed back to the car and made the short drive across town. After parking near the entrance to the park, we crossed a beautiful, partly covered wooden bridge over the Narewka River and entered a peaceful landscape of ponds, walking paths, and mature trees. We'd come to the right place. This tranquil park was once the center of a vast imperial estate. By the lakeshore, we spotted a wooden cabin. Initially, we thought that this might have been the Tsar's hunting lodge, but it turned out to be the governor's manor house instead. Dating back to 1845, it's the oldest surviving building in Białowieża. But the palace itself was nowhere to be seen. We soon realized that it no longer exists. Built between 1889 and 1894 for Tsar Alexander III, the Tsar's hunting palace was once a spectacular residence that contained more than 100 rooms, towers, and ornate interiors. Photographs from the period show a building that would not have looked out of place among the great royal residences of Europe. After being damaged during the Second World War, the palace was eventually demolished. Today, the same site is home to the headquarters of Białowieża National Park. Looking around, it was hard not to appreciate the symbolism. The palace has disappeared, the empire has vanished, but the forest remains. Where Tsars once planned hunting expeditions into the forest, the focus today is on conservation and protecting one of Europe's last remaining primeval woodlands. Białowieża National Park in eastern Poland is home to a rare remnant of Europe's ancient primeval forests. This national park is home to more than 12,000 animal species, including the largest population of free-roaming European bison. Since 1979, this place has been recognized as being part of the UNESCO World Heritage List. The most heavily protected part of the national park is the strict reserve, which can only be visited in the company of a licensed guide, who you'll need to arrange in advance. This is the closest visitors can get to experiencing the forest in its most natural state. A place where wildlife still lives much as it always has, and where even the smallest sound can send an animal quietly back into the trees. As we inquired about joining a tour ourselves, we mentioned how keen we were to see bison in their natural habitat. That's when we learned that while bison live throughout the forest, they are often surprisingly difficult to spot among the trees in summer. If our goal was to see wild bison, we were told that open clearings would likely offer a much better chance than the forest itself. Meadows, just like the one we'd already visited earlier that morning. So instead of booking a guided tour into the National Park's strict reserve, we headed back to the edge of the forest as dusk settled over the forest of Białowieża. Here we were again, standing up on the viewing platform and scanning the meadow, hoping for a glimpse of Białowieża's majestic animals. Just like in the morning, thin wisps of fog drifted across the grass, gradually spreading over the landscape as the evening light began to fade. The atmosphere was nothing short of magical, perfectly in tune with the nature around us. As the forest disappeared into shadow and the meadow fell silent, it felt as though the pace of life had slowed to match the rhythm of the wilderness. Eventually, the last traces of daylight faded from the meadow, and with them our hopes of seeing a bison that evening. For the second time that day, the bison remained elusive. And yet, it was difficult to feel disappointed. If anything, we were now more determined than ever to give it another go early the next morning. The next morning, after another short night, we were up before sunrise once again. This time, we headed further away from town to Carska Tropina, the Tsars Trail. After everything we'd learned about Białowieża's imperial past, the name felt strangely appropriate. More than a century ago, imperial hunting parties used routes like this to venture deep into the forest in search of wildlife. Now we found ourselves doing much the same. As the first light of day began filtering through the trees, we followed the trail deeper into the forest. Eventually, the forest opened up into a large clearing where we settled in to wait. But once again, the forest kept its secrets. No bison. By now, however, we were beginning to appreciate that this was simply part of the experience. Białowieża isn't a wildlife park. It's a wild forest. And in a wild forest, nothing is guaranteed. Even though our search wasn't over yet, we felt it was time to change tactics. Just a short drive away lies Żebra Żubra, literally the bison's ribs, a wooden boardwalk that winds through a particularly scenic section of the forest. The unusual name comes from the way the wooden planks of the elevated walkway look a bit like the ribs of a skeleton. The boardwalk meanders through wetlands, mixed woodland, and small clearings, offering a completely different perspective on Białowieża's wilderness. And before long, it led us to a place where even we would have a chance to see bison at last, the European Bison Show Reserve. Now admittedly, seeing bison in an enclosure isn't quite the same as encountering them in the wild, but after several unsuccessful attempts, this seemed like our best shot. At the same time, a visit here helps support ongoing conservation efforts that have played an important role in the survival of the species. Stepping inside, it quickly became clear that this wasn't simply a place to see bison. The reserve is also home to several other species that inhabit the forests of Białowieża, giving visitors the opportunity to observe animals that are famously difficult to encounter in the wild. The first animals we saw were wolves. Although we'd heard them howling from our accommodation at night, this was the first time we'd actually seen them, quietly resting in the shade during the heat of the afternoon. A little further on, deer grazed peacefully among the trees. Then came the moment we'd been waiting for, bison at last. After spending 2 mornings and an evening searching for them in the wild, finally seeing these magnificent animals up close was a genuinely special moment. But perhaps what struck us most was knowing that beyond the fence, wild bison still roam freely through this ancient forest. After several days of searching, finally seeing the bison left us with a real sense of satisfaction. There seemed no better way to savor the moment than over a leisurely lunch back in the village. Appropriately enough, we found ourselves at Gospoda pod Żubrem, the inn beneath the bison. The menu once again celebrated the flavors of the region, so we couldn't resist trying venison pierogi, traditional potato sausage with sour cream and cabbage, pelmeni, and another slice of marcinek cake. It turns out that exploring Białowieża is every bit as rewarding for your taste buds as it is for nature lovers. But our adventure in Białowieża wasn't quite over yet. There was still one more place we wanted to visit, a place that, perhaps more than anywhere else, reveals just how much this extraordinary forest has changed over the past century. Leaving the village behind once more, we followed a narrow forest road east for a short distance, through the forest until we could go no further. Białowieża National Park is right up against the border with Belarus. Behind me you can see the border checkpoint going into the neighboring country, and behind there would actually be the Belarusian National Park, which unfortunately, due to the current political circumstances, is not accessible because the border checkpoint is currently closed. We had reached the eastern edge of Poland, the eastern edge of the European Union, and even the edge of a time zone. Yet, for most of its history, none of this existed. There was a time when this was one continuous forest, with wildlife and people moving freely across what is today one of Europe's most heavily guarded frontiers. Now, the road simply comes to an end. Lost in thought, we made our way back to our accommodation one final time, through a forest that seemed as mysterious as when we'd first arrived. That evening, sitting beside the campfire, we found ourselves reflecting on everything we'd experienced. We'd come here hoping to see Europe's largest land mammal, but we would leave with something far more memorable. A deeper appreciation for a forest that has quietly witnessed centuries of history, changing borders and shifting empires, yet continues to endure much as it always has. And gratitude for the chance to have experienced it, if only for a few days.